Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy tonight to be able to introduce our speaker, Catherine Cornille from Boston College. The article she gave us to read was from Jacques Dupuy, a Jesuit who did some cutting-edge work while he was in India in comparative theology and interreligious theology. And on one of the pages here, she has a quotation from the Secretariat for Non-Christians, or I shouldn't say she does, rather Dupuy's does. And Dupuy says that the Secretariat in this 1984 document summed up felicitously what the Council's various teachings were on non-Christian religions. And the paragraph goes like this. The vision induced the fathers of the Second Vatican Council to affirm that in the religious traditions of non-Christians there exist elements which are true and good, precious things, both religious and human, seeds of contemplation, elements of truth and grace, seeds of the word, and rays of that truth which illumines all humankind. These are all quotations from the various council documents put together in a kind of catena. According to explicit conciliar indications, these values are found preserved in the great religious traditions of humanity. Therefore, they merit the attention and the esteem of Christians, and their spiritual patrimony is a genuine invitation to dialogue, not only in those things which unite us, but also in our differences. So that's one of the more enlightened documents from the Vatican summarizing some of the teaching of the Council. Professor Cornille will elaborate on this for us. She's a professor of comparative theology and chair of the Department of Theology at Boston College. I've had the privilege of knowing you now for some time through the Catholic Theological Society of America. Her teaching and research focus mainly on methodological questions in the study of religion, inculturation, interreligious dialogue, and comparative theology. She is the author of The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue and of several edited volumes, including Song Divine, Christian Commentaries on the Bhagavadgita, Criteria of Discernment in Interreligious Dialogue, The World, Market, and Interreligious Dialogue, and is the editor of the Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue, which is scheduled to appear this year. It just came out. Okay, congratulations. And so we'll follow the usual pattern. Professor Cornille will speak for the rest of the hour. We'll take a short break, 7 to 10 minutes or so, and then our panel will convene with some reflections upon the topic, and then we will open it up to questions and discussion. Okay? Catherine, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you, Paul, for the invitation. Thank you, Nancy, for helping out and picking me up. I think you actually know more than I do by now about Vatican II after all of the lectures that you've been through. But what I would like to do this evening is talk in particular about Vatican II and whether Vatican II is or is not a real milestone in the Church's relationship to other religious traditions. In some ways, what was just quoted, what Paul just quoted, summarizes indeed much of what I will bring up also in my talk. But my question is precisely now, is this a radical change in the Church's attitude towards other religions, and how can we understand this? And what are the implications of everything that has been said? And I will come back to that as I go along. So the document we'll be looking at this evening is actually the shortest document of all Vatican II documents. It's called Nostra Aetate. The Latin title is actually refers to the first words of the document. It's actually the declaration on the relationship of the Church to non-Christian religions. It's a very short document. It has only 41 sentences, and it has a very interesting and complex history of development and gestation. And so before I come to talk a little bit more about the context, I'd like to say a few things about the history of the document so you understand where all of these ideas came from. And then we'll situate those ideas in the context of what came before and what has come since. So first, a few words about the history of the document. Originally, there was actually no intention at Vatican II to produce anything on non-Christian religions. Pope John the 23rd had given the mandate to the Secretariat for Ecumenism to draft a document on ecumenism, but there was no talk about other religions. In 1961, the Pope met Jules Isaac, who was a Jewish rabbi who was very involved in the relationship between Jews and Christians, and had founded an organization called Amitié Judéo-Chrétien, and they had developed a memorandum on Jewish-Christian relations. Now, we're, of course, historically thinking about the period right after the Holocaust, and all of the issues that have come up in terms of the complicity of the church in, its kind of latent anti-Semitism and its lack of active speaking up at the time of the Holocaust. So all of these issues were in the air. And Isaac had formed this group to create this memorandum about Jewish-Christian relations and how it can move forward. So the Pope meets this rabbi, and they have a half-hour meeting at which Isaac presents him with a summary of the memorandum. After that meeting, then, the Pope gives the mandate to Cardinal Bea, who was the head of the Pontifical Council for Ecumenism, to also think about the Jewish question, as they called it. So to also think about the Jewish question. There was nothing said yet about whether or not a document had to come out of it or not, but he gave at least a mandate to think about it in the context of the broader ecumenism. And that, of course, was partly in reaction to everything that had happened in the first part of the century. Not realizing what the implications would be of that kind of mandate for the relationship with Arabic countries, of course. So after this reflection started, many of the Arabic countries were up in arms about the involvement of the Catholic Church with Jewish-Christian relations and what that might mean for the state of Israel and all of the complications that came about with that. I won't go into details, but it certainly caused an upheaval. Nevertheless, it went through, but not as part of the decree on ecumenism. It was allowed to exist as a separate declaration, which doesn't have the weight of a dogmatic constitution. It's a declaration on the relationship of the church to non-Christian religions. So its orientation is much more pastoral than dogmatic. It was allowed to go through, but as soon as it hit the floor of the cardinals, the bishops who were from Africa and Asia immediately reacted and said, well, if we have something on the Jews, why not also something on Hindus and Buddhists? And of course, with all of the upheaval in Arabic countries, then the Council Fathers also felt called to say something about the relationship of the Church to Muslims. So out of all of that came this very short, but I think very important document, Nostra Aetate. I don't know if I had people read it in preparation. Were you able to read it? Wonderful. So the document starts with a very generous sort of introduction about what all religions have in common with one another in terms of the search for God and the attempt to live a good life and to think about life after death and so forth. So an emphasis on what all religions have in common in terms of their religious orientation. Then the document goes to what is specific about Hinduism and what is specific about Buddhism. And then comes a very interesting and relevant passage that I want to quote because we'll probably come back to it later. It says, after talking about Hinduism and Buddhism, the Catholic Church rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions. She has a high regard for the manner of life and conduct, the precepts and doctrines which, although differing in many ways from her own teaching, nevertheless often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men. Yet she proclaims, and is in duty bound to proclaim without fail, Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. In him, in whom God reconciled all things to himself, men find the fullness of their religious life. The Church therefore urges her sons to enter with prudence and charity into discussion and collaboration with members of other religions. Let Christians, while witnessing to their own faith and way of life, acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found among non-Christians, also their social life and culture. So this, I think, is a very important passage that we will come back to. After that, the document continues and talks about, in particular, the relationship with Muslims, and there it emphasizes again what the Church has in common with Muslims. And then it finishes by saying, over the centuries, many quarrels and dissensions have arisen between Christians and Muslims. The Sacred Council now pleads with all to forget the past and urges that a sincere effort be made to achieve mutual understanding for the benefit of all men. Let them together preserve and promote peace, liberty, social justice, and moral values. And then the last and longest part of Nostra Aetate is about the relationship with the Jews. And here the main concern was to do away with all of the attitudes of supersessionism that had been part of Christian relationship to Judaism in its history, and to also do away with the accusation of deicide, or the idea that Jews killed Jesus and therefore are permanently outside of God's grace. All of this, these ideas which had been part of sort of the breeding ground for anti-Semitism, all of those ideas are clearly denounced in this document. And the emphasis in that whole paragraph, that whole last paragraph on Nostra Aetate, is what Christians have in common with Jews and the same foundation, and that God does not take away the promise that he has made to his people. It's a very important sentence that's part of that last paragraph. God does not take away the promise he has made to his people, and all Jews cannot be accused of the killing of Jesus, neither in Jesus' time nor since the death of Jesus. So clearly distancing from the accusation of deicide, and an emphasis again on the continued validity of Judaism even after the coming of Christianity. So these are, this is very briefly the content of Nostra Aetate. I just want to mention one other document that deals with the relationship to other religions and that has a little bit more of dogmatic weight, and that's Lumen Gentium, the doctrinal constitution on the Church, in chapter 16. It's a very short paragraph, and I'll read it to you. Before that came, the document talks about the relationship with other Christian churches. Finally, those who have not yet received the gospel are related to the people of God in various ways. There is first that people to which the covenants and promises were made, and from which Christ was born according to the flesh. In view of the divine choice, they are the people most dear for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts of God are without repentance. But the plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator, in the first place among whom are the Muslims. They profess to hold the faith of Abraham, and together with us they adore the one merciful God, mankind's judge on the last day. Nor is God remote from those who in shadows and images seek the unknown God, since he gives to all men life and breath and all things, and since the Savior wills all men to be saved. those who, through no fault of their own, do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, but who nevertheless seek God with a sincere heart and, moved by grace, try in their actions to do his will as they know it through the dictates of their conscience, those too may achieve eternal salvation. Nor shall divine providence deny the assistance necessary for salvation to those who, without any fruit of theirs, have not yet arrived at an explicit knowledge of God, and who, not without grace, strive to lead a good life. Whatever good or truth is found amongst them is considered by the Church to be a preparation for the gospel, and given by him who enlightens all men, that they may at length have life. But very often, deceived by the evil one, men have become vain in their reasonings, have exchanged truth of God for lie, and served the world rather than the Creator. Or else, living and dying in this world without God, they are exposed to ultimate despair. Hence, to procure the glory of God and the salvation of all these, the Church, mindful of the Lord's command, preach the gospel to every creature, take zealous care to foster the missions. That's the paragraph. So these are the texts that we will be discussing for the rest of the evening. So what I want to look at is, what is so special about these documents? And you probably think, that you have already heard this many times, or, this almost seems passé for people. Now it's so obvious. But what I want to make clear is that this was really revolutionary in its time in many ways. How was it revolutionary? First of all, up to Vatican II, there had never been any positive proclamation or statement made by the Vatican about other religions. You can say that there actually had never been any statement made explicitly, positively or negatively. Now, that can be debated, and we can go into that. But Vatican II was the first time the Church said anything, magisterially about other religious traditions. Not only did they say something, but they said a lot of very positive things about other religions, which at the time was quite mind-boggling. Because, of course, those of you who lived before the Second Vatican Council know that prior to Vatican II, the Church's attitude to other religions was dominated by the expression, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the Church, there is no salvation. And that has been, the dominant attitude of the Church up to Vatican II. Now, what does that mean, though, outside of the Church? There is no salvation. It doesn't, first a little bit about the history of the expression. The expression goes back to the 3rd century. Cyprian of Carthage is the one who originally pronounced that expression. He actually didn't use it with reference to non-Christians. He used it to refer to schismatics and heretics within the Church. And in particular, in the context of the Decian persecution, when many Christians had fallen from the faith and wanted to come back to the Church, there were some bishops who held the hard line and didn't want Christians to be readmitted easily. And they were threatening to cause dissension in the Church and division. And those were the target of this expression. So outside the one Church of Christ, there is no salvation. So his target were heretic and schismatic Christians, not non-Christians. However, in the course of history, by the 14th, 15th century, the expression was picked up again in the context that everyone who has not yet become baptized is doomed to eternal damnation and so forth. Not only the Jews, but also the idolaters and pagans and so forth. So it then comes to be picked up in the course of history with reference to non-Christians, but it wasn't intended originally in that way. That, of course, does not mean that there was always the implicit idea that only through the Church could one be saved. You all know the fundamental, biblical texts in John that talk, where Jesus is said, quoting, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Or in the Acts of the Apostles, "There is no other name through which we may be saved." all of these biblical sayings that emphasize the absolute uniqueness of Jesus Christ as Savior have always been central to Christian faith, central to the Apostles' Creed and central to Christian faith, that only through Jesus Christ and through explicit faith in Christ and through baptism can one be saved. So that, of course, has always been part of Christian teaching. However, throughout history, the very idea that baptism was necessary for salvation rarely implied that anyone who was not baptized was necessarily doomed. For example, in the Middle Ages, there, of course, during the periods of exploration, when a lot of a lot of people were discovered that had never had a chance even to encounter the gospel, that posed a huge problem theologically. How can they all be doomed? Those who came before Christ and those who never had a chance to meet Christ. And so there were all kinds of theological ideas that were developed to make sense of that. Already the Church Fathers talked about the seeds of the word that were present already among Greek philosophers, but also among people who lived a holy life since Christ but were not Christians. So there are seeds of the word present outside of the bounds of the church. There was the idea, or during the Council of Trent, a distinction was made between actual baptism, or baptism in re, and baptism of desire. So the idea was that those people who never had a chance to meet Christ, but who lived a holy life, by their holy life expressed a desire for baptism. So their holiness was itself an expression of their implicit desire for baptism. So the distinction between the baptism of desire and the actual baptism allowed the church to recognize that there might be people outside of the church who are saved, even though they're not actually baptized. Then in the 19th century, Pope Pius IX introduced the expression invincible ignorance in 1854. That meant that those who, again, through no fault of their own, did not know Christ or his gospel cannot be held accountable for that and can or do not have to be regarded as necessarily doomed. So invincible ignorance, that expression, allowed for the possibility of salvation outside of the church for people who had never known Christ. And then the question comes, of course, what does it mean to know Christ? Already, during the Crusades also, some Dominicans had big debates about that also. When the Conquista happened in Latin America and the missionaries came with the sword imposing Christianity on the Indians, was that, for people who then converted to Christianity, were they then justified for converting to this violent religion, or were the people who refused to convert to this violent religion, in fact, more justified? So there were debates about the way in which Christianity was presented and how one was to react to this kind of faith or missionary activity. So there had always been these kinds of discussions going on. And then, of course, the question is, what does it mean to know the gospel? Is it just being taught the gospel, or does it mean to be touched personally and existentially by Christ? So the idea finally was that if people were personally and existentially touched by the truth of the gospel and consciously refused to convert or to accept Christ, they are then liable and will not be saved. You see, so it's a pretty small group of people that would be condemned under those terms. What's interesting also is that the church actually, when church leaders in the history of Christianity used that expression extra ecclesiam nulla salus in the literal sense of the term, the church has actually come down very critically against those people. And of course, I'm thinking of Cardinal Feeney in Boston in the beginning of the 20th century. He actually taught at Boston College and was a Jesuit. And he held that expression, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, in the most strict, rigid sense of the term, and was denounced for that by Cardinal Cushing. So was put out, excommunicated, in fact, put outside of the church for holding that view. Just to say that the church, even though it has always emphasized that salvation is only through Christ, through baptism, through belonging to the church, it has always also recognized that God can save outside of the church, and that the church itself does not have necessarily a monopoly over salvation, that God can save in God's own ways outside of the church. And I think that's important to point out. However, as I said before, there never had been a clear pronouncement on the Church's attitude to non-Christian religions until Vatican II. And to understand, the urgency at Vatican II, of course, as I already mentioned, the Holocaust had happened, and it was just something that had to be addressed in one way or the other by the Church. But in addition to that, there, in the beginning of the 20th century was the time in which knowledge of other religions just exploded. We have to remember that until the end of the 19th century, knowledge of Buddhism was incredibly primitive. It's very entertaining to look at texts that talk about Buddhism and what a completely wrong view they had of Buddhism at the time. So in the beginning of the 20th century, texts are being translated. The first chair of Sanskrit was established in the middle of the 19th century in Paris, and then the study of Sanskrit developed. The study of Pali developed. Texts were being translated in the 19th century from other religions. The Sacred Books of the East was published in the 1860s. So suddenly we have an explosion of documentation about other religions that did away with all the caricatures and the misconceptions that Christianity had about other religions. And theologians started to study other religions, and missionaries started to study other religions. So, the missionaries who went to India until the end of the 19th century really knew very little about Hinduism, and now they're reading texts and immersing themselves in Indian spirituality. And many of you probably know Bede Griffiths and Henri Le Sceau, maybe, these Christian missionaries who go to India, who take their robes off and dress in kavi, the clothes of the Indian sannyasi, who practice Hindu yoga and forms of worship and so on. So you have these missionaries who go to countries, Massignon, same in Muslim countries. So Christian missionaries steep themselves in other religions and suddenly discover the wealth and depth of spiritual richness and insight in those religions, and come back to the West. And theologians here, in France, de Lubac starts hearing about all of this, and he does actually, Henri de Lubac does a really interesting study of Amida Buddhism in the beginning of the 20th century. So you have all these theologians who are working on other religions and really starting to understand more of what's going on in a realistic fashion, and then who influence other theologians, people like Rahner, who was, of course, a great influence on Vatican II, or Raimundo Panikkar, who himself was half Hindu. So all of this is happening already prior to the council. So I'm just trying to sketch the context. It's not like from one day to the next, suddenly the church makes a complete turn. This is already developing, and the church picks it up and puts it in all of these beautiful and generous words. So that happens, and as a consequence of this document, all kinds of things happen in the church. A whole discipline develops called theology of religions, and many of us have got positions at university because of these disciplines. That's what I teach at Boston College, theology of religions and comparative theology. So I owe my career to this document. So what is theology of religions? It's sort of a further thinking about what the Christian attitude towards religious pluralism is from within a Christian doctrinal self-understanding. So Christian theology of religions in principle theologians don't necessarily even have to know other religions to think about what the church's attitude could possibly be towards other religions. And so in this discipline, all kinds of positions have developed in the past 50 years, going from, very traditional, conservative to very liberal, open. The terms that are usually used are exclusivism, only salvation through baptism and through Christianity, pluralism, salvation in all religions, inclusivism, possibility of salvation in other religions, but only through Jesus Christ. Of course, these categories can be applied to any religious tradition. But anyway, within Christianity, this whole discipline has developed where different theologians took different positions. And someone like Jacques Dupuy, for example, is a theologian who very much also contributed in major ways to the Church's reflection on other religions. What else happens? Development of all kinds of forms of dialogue. Now dialogue becomes the buzzword in the Church's relationship to other religions. And in some of the documents, there are 4 kinds of dialogue that are put forward. The dialogue of daily life, people living together and living in peace together and friendly neighborhoodliness together. The dialogue of common action, where people from different faiths commit themselves to social projects together and try to make the world a better place by collaboration. The spiritual dialogue, which is the dialogue which has taken a flight in terms of intermonastic dialogue. I don't know if you've heard of that, but this is something that has developed also in the 70s, more in the 80s, where monks, Catholic monks, go and spend time in monasteries, mostly Buddhist monasteries, and Buddhist monks come and spend time in Catholic monasteries and really immerse themselves in the spiritual life of the other and do a spiritual exchange. Spirituality has always been the area of interreligious dialogue, which has been easiest, I suppose. We won't go there because that's, again, a very big topic. But that's another area of interreligious dialogue, spiritual dialogue. And then there's a theological dialogue that happens between experts or theologians of different religions, where people from different religions try to learn not only about one another, but also from one another. And that's, I think, the major change that has happened probably in the past 20 years. Right after Vatican II, there was still a steep learning curve about other religions. But in the past 20 years, a whole new field of inquiry has developed called comparative theology, which is theology. It's not comparative religion, it's theology. So done in a confessional way, but in dialogue with another religious tradition and really trying to mine the other tradition for what Christians can potentially learn from the other religious tradition. Of course, I'm just speaking about comparative theology from a Christian perspective, but Buddhists have also come to do comparative theology and even use that term, comparative theology. So it can be done from any particular religious tradition. But of course, it requires a whole new way of looking at the other and of looking at one's own tradition also. So the book that Paul mentioned, my book, The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue, there's a dash between im and possibility, really is an attempt to look from a Christian perspective at what the conditions are for that kind of comparative theology to be fruitful and to have an effect. Because religions, let's face it, are not by nature oriented towards learning from each other. And so what I've tried to do in that book is show how still you can mine your own tradition to find resources that open you up to learning from another religious tradition. So the area of comparative theology has taken a flight. At Boston College, we have actually a sub-field in theology called comparative theology. I teach Hinduism and Christianity. Others do Buddhism and Christianity, Islam and Christianity. So this is a field that's really developing and exploding with very interesting consequences we can't go into right now. But you see how dialogue has really become the buzzword. On the other hand, the way the Vatican understands dialogue and the way some theologians understand dialogue has sometimes led to, let's say, a misunderstanding between the two. So when the Vatican talks about dialogue, it's mostly the first two types of dialogue of peaceful coexistence and collaboration, mutual understanding. All of that is dialogue. When we, in comparative theology and theology of religions, focus on dialogue, it's much more, in a proactive, constructive theological way of, maybe we can actually learn something new from these other religious traditions. But that, of course, is a bit threatening for the Vatican. And what we see is, in fact, a backlash against this, rush to dialogue, if you will, in the Church. With that emphasis on dialogue, of course, another consequence, unintended consequence, has been a complete diminishment of interest in evangelization and mission. Even though all of the texts, including Nostra Aetate and Lumen Gentium, talk about the importance still of proclaiming Christ and of going out and making or baptizing and proclaiming the gospel. So documents still emphasize it. And another document, I don't know if you've read it already, Agentes, in fact, makes mission a responsibility of the whole Church, not just missionaries, but every Christian is held to proclaim the gospel. So you can say that Vatican II, on the one hand, opens up to dialogue. On the other hand, encourages every Christian to proclaim the faith and spread the gospel. So those two elements are emphasized at Vatican II, but the mission side of it, I think, became completely watered down and not at all emphasized. And so what we see since Vatican II is then a constant attempt by the magisterium of the Church to re-emphasize the importance of mission. So documents like Redemptoris Missio, for example, Dialogue and Proclamation, Dominus Jesus, are all documents that have come out since Vatican II, trying to lift up the importance of evangelization and mission as just as important, if not more important, than actual dialogue. So Redemptoris Missio is all about the missionary responsibility of Christians. Dialogue and Proclamation keeps emphasizing that mission and dialogue are both important, but that they shouldn't be confused with one another, that they each have their own place in the Church, and that we should keep both, our focus on both. Redemptoris Missio, I don't know how many of you have read that document. It was very controversial when it came out in the year 2000. And what it tried to do actually was redress some of the exaggerations, I suppose what they would call it, that have happened since Vatican II. So since Vatican II, people like Jacques Dupuy and Paul Nitter and a number of other comparative theologians and theologians of religions had gone too far, according to the Vatican, in their openness to other religious traditions. And what we see in Dominus Jesus is an attempt to reel back, or reel back? What's the English? Reel back the Church from what is seen as, exaggerated pluralism, exaggerated emphasis on the goodness of other religions and the positive things that are in other religions. And what you see in Dominus Jesus, it's really worth reading the document, is I can almost point with every paragraph to who the document reacts against in terms of theologians and what they have said. But what the document tries to do is say, there is truth in other religions, but there's also falsehood in other religions. Let's not exaggerate that all religions are equal and true to Christianity. There are also errors in other religious traditions, and there is revelation only in Christian scriptures, there are elements of truth and goodness in other religions, but revelation only in Christian scripture. Only through baptism do you have the certainty of salvation and so on. So, and only through belonging to the church. So what Dominus Jesus tries to do is sort of, retreat from this exaggerated openness to other religions and reaffirm some of the doctrines of the church that it felt were being threatened by two pluralistic orientations. So you see, the Vatican II has really opened up the doors. The Vatican then tried to sort of wheel it back a bit, and this is where we are now. Just recently, actually, just before he stepped down, Benedict XVI made a radio comment at the occasion of the commemoration of Vatican II, where he comments on Nostra Aetate, and this is what he says. A weakness of this otherwise extraordinary text has gradually emerged. It speaks of religion solely in a positive way, and it disregards the sick and distorted forms of religion, which, from the historical and theological viewpoints, are of far-reaching importance, and which explain why Christians for centuries had been mostly critical of other religions. So, I mean, this is not an official statement of the church, but you see what he's also trying to do is, again, temper the kind of openness and positive attitude towards other religions, which threatens the missionary orientation of Christians. So, is Vatican II truly a milestone? I would say yes, in creating that kind of openness to other religions. On the other hand, Vatican II never really affirmed the idea that there is salvation in other religions. It states that there are elements of goodness and truth in other religions, but it doesn't say that those religions themselves are means to salvation. So it never affirms the salvific efficacy of other religions. Now this is a point that has been widely discussed also, and in your text, Jacques Dupuy, for example, says, while never formally recognizing in the other religious traditions channels of salvation for their members in accordance with God's providence in Jesus Christ, the Council nevertheless seems to incline in that direction by implication when it acknowledges, so he goes on, it doesn't affirm it, but he believes that it really implied in the affirmation of truth and goodness in other religions is the idea that they are means to salvation. That's what Dupuy says. But then just a few months ago, a book came out with a title, Will Many Be Saved? ? What Vatican actually teaches and its implications for the new evangelization by Rolf Martin. And he says that Vatican II, in fact, clearly states that members of other religions are still under the governance of original sin, and that there is still sort of, or that other religions cannot be seen as means to salvation in the same way as Christianity is. So you see, again, two different directions in terms of the interpretation of Vatican II. My view of it is that Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, doesn't say anything about whether non-Christians are saved or not. And to me, that's the most brilliant part of the text. How can we know whether people who are not Christians can be saved or not? As Christians, all we know is that Christ and Christianity offers a means to salvation. We can't say that others aren't saved. How would we know that? But we can also not say that they are saved. We wouldn't know that either, right? So the kind of what I called soteriological agnosticism of the text, I find personally a brilliant statement of humility on the part of the church. Whether it's intended or not, I will keep believing that it was intended. And build on that idea that as Christians, we simply cannot say anything about whether non-Christians are saved or not. It's only God who knows whether non-Christians are saved or not. We cannot affirm, we cannot deny it. I think both theologically and phenomenologically, that is a perfectly sound position, and I think that's where we should stand as Christians. Now, what are the implications of that position? Does that mean that we shouldn't proclaim the gospel anymore because maybe they are saved? No. I think it should mean that we still do proclaim the gospel because we don't know that whether they're saved or not. And also because as Christians we believe, or should believe, that we have something of value to offer people from other religions. So that's another point where in the Christian engagement with other religions since Vatican II, we've been pretty timid and shy as Christians to confess our faith and share our faith with people from other religions. The tendency has been mostly to admire other religions and feel like, Christianity has mostly to learn from other religions, but there is indeed, a need for sort of a new enthusiasm on the part of Christians to share what we have and what other religions might be able to learn from Christians. But there's also an urgency for dialogue because people in other religions may indeed be vehicles to salvation. And we do believe that there is truth and goodness in other religions. So if we believe that, we should really be willing and eager to enter into dialogue with other religions and see how we can grow in our own self-understanding and in our understanding of the truth through dialogue with other religions. So I think it encourages both mission or evangelization and dialogue with other religions. And I would go even further. So the church has always sort of tried to keep mission and dialogue separate from each other out of fear that dialogue would sort of take over and mission would disappear. I think the emphasis on the distinction between dialogue and mission has been really negative and devastating for the relationship with other religions. I always hear people from other religions say, well, you pretend to be interested in dialogue, but really, once you turn your back, the missionaries are going to come and are going to try to make us Christians. So they don't believe the sincerity of the attempt to dialogue with other religions if, they think that mission is really something different from dialogue. So, and I see it constantly, like in India, where there's a big sort of fear of conversion and aversion to conversion. Everything that Christians do, even in a sincere openness to dialogue with Hindus, is taken with suspicion. So if we would see dialogue and mission as one and the same activity, I think it would also lift dialogue to another level. Dialogue, interreligious dialogue, is not just learning about the other and exchanging information. It's mutual witnessing. That's how I understand dialogue. Not just exchange of information, but mutual witnessing to the truth of your own religion. And that's the way you will, be lit up by another religion. If the person who shares their faith is themselves enthusiastic and filled with the spirit or whatever they feel is the truth of their religion, that's what lights up the dialogue partner too. And so I think as Christians also, we could lift our own engagement in dialogue up by being more witnessing to our own faith and to the truth of our faith. And if the two are seen as one and the same activity, I think it will help our relationship with other religions and, as I said, lift up dialogue to be something that has more life and energy and future. So by way of conclusion, what I've been trying to say is that the Church's attitude towards other religions has not changed fundamentally in terms of its doctrinal understanding of other religions as means to salvation. But as I said, what I've tried to say is that there's maybe a deeper wisdom in that we can lift out of it, out of that soteriological agnosticism, as I call it. It has created, Vatican II, though, a radical change in our interest in other religions, in the Church's openness to other religions. Even during Vatican II, there was the establishment of a secretariat for non-Christians that became the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue later and has engaged in all kinds of interreligious activities. as I said, there's been this explosion of theological interest and engagement with religious diversity, and that has all been made possible through Vatican II, or we all refer back to Vatican II. Some blame Vatican II for everything that has happened in terms of those relationships. Now, would that not have happened if Vatican II hadn't happened? As I said, there was already sort of a big development or theological evolution that was happening in the early 20th century that led to this new attitude at Vatican II. So it's hard to say whether that would or wouldn't have happened without Vatican II, but I think it's safe to say that Vatican II really was a milestone in terms of opening up the possibility for really interesting and engaged and active dialogue with other religions. Thank you very much.
All right, we have three guests joining us here on the panel. The first here is someone many of you are familiar with, Scotty McLennan, the Dean of Religious Life here at Stanford. His duties include providing spiritual, moral, and ethical leadership to the university as a whole, and teaching and encouraging a wide spectrum of religious traditions on campus. If you go to the website, it's very impressive here. I think I was reading someplace where Stanford is one of the most religiously active schools of our type in the country. Scotty is an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister and an attorney. So his most recent book is Jesus Was a Liberal, Reclaiming Christianity for All. And then to Catherine's right is Akiba Lerner. Akiba is my colleague at Santa Clara University, where he is assistant professor in religious studies with a specialization in Jewish thought, modern Jewish thought. He writes that he's born to a Christian mother and a Jewish father. In one form or another, he's been involved, therefore, in interfaith dialogue his whole life. He earned his PhD here at Stanford and came to Stanford after a BA at Cal in history. Sorry. Well, as he says here, unlike his decision to become a Jewish studies scholar, however, he's never attended a big game so as to avoid having to choose sides. He also spent several years in Israel. Very, very interesting years, which we won't go into right here now. And he's currently working on a book entitled Redemptive Hope from the Age of Enlightenment to the Age of Obama. So we're looking forward to that. And then finally, Maruf Khan, I call him Maruf because that's the more familiar name, was one of my students at Berkeley. Maruf is a member of and a leader of the local Sufi community, and your mosque is here in Palo Alto. And a group of us from Santa Clara just recently visited your mosque in Friday night prayers. It was just a really wonderful experience. Some of you may be interested to know that Maruf is also studying for a master's degree in theology at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, which is how he ended up in my class at the GTU a while back. Professionally, he's an IT engineer and has a BS in electrical engineering and an MA in education in mathematics. So we're very happy to welcome you, Maruf, to the table. So I thought we could begin by hearing from Scotty.
Well, I want to thank Professor Cornille for a magnificent lecture that I think in 45 minutes laid out complexities and history in a way that's the best I've ever seen. It was really a joy to listen. And as I was listening, I was thinking at one point you mentioned exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism as these terms that are used in your field. And I wanted to expand on those a little bit and see if they would be helpful for us in our discussion. I was in school years ago with Diana Eck, who is at Harvard and who you told me you're going to be teaching a course with within the next year. And she heads up the Pluralism Project at Harvard that's looked at traditions, how they live and work throughout this continent. And she talks about exclusivism as our own community, our tradition, our understanding of reality, our encounter with God as the one and only truth, excluding all others, and exclusivist identity as being in part what social theorists call oppositional identity, built up over against what we are not. And it's a conviction about the finality and absolute priority of one's own tradition over competing views, separating us from them. And it's little wonder, Diana Eck says, that exclusivism has been one of the tools of racism and ethnocentrism. Then she talks about inclusivism as being there are many communities, traditions, truths, but our own way of seeing things is the culmination of the others, superior to the others, or at least wide enough to include the others under our universal canopy and in our own terms. And I think so much of what you've said tonight about the Vatican II tradition is inclusivist, although I'm sure in discussion we will hear more about a pluralist vision and understanding. So the problem, of course, with inclusivism is that it often hides within it a hierarchical acceptance of the plurality of religions with one's own view of things on top, and it's a hierarchical view that often goes unreflectively with power, and everybody's invited in, but we're the ones who put up the tent, and everything's within our terms and under our canopy and part of our system. Pluralism is the claim that truth is not the exclusive or inclusive possession of any one tradition or community, but the diversity of communities and traditions and understandings of the truth and visions of God isn't an obstacle for us to overcome, but an opportunity for energetic engagement and dialogue with each other. It doesn't necessarily mean giving up our commitments, but opening those commitments to the give and take of mutual discovery, understanding, and indeed transformation. And if we're pluralists, we recognize the limits of the world that we know, and we seek to understand others in their terms, not just in ours. And from a Christian pluralist perspective, the multiplicity of religious ways is a concomitant of the ultimacy and many-sidedness of God, the one who can't be limited or encircled by any one tradition. So I actually would, if we had infinite time and I've only got a couple of minutes left, I'd like to explore even another step beyond this to a world theology. And one of Diana Eck's teachers, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, published a book toward a world theology, it was called, where he said history has now brought us to a point where it's requisite to have a theology that emerges out of all of the religions of the world. And that means that we can no longer afford to practice, study, and understand our own religious tradition in isolation, certainly, because the world's become too small and globalization has progressed too far, communication's too good, and a little incomplete knowledge of others can be downright dangerous, indeed breeding bigotry and violence. But he goes on to say it's ultimately global suicide for us to speak in terms of we and they, rather than in terms of a worldwide we, albeit within which this we, there's enormous and precious diversity. And it's no longer possible to develop a Christian theology or a Muslim theology or a Hindu theology without taking into account the other traditions and their understandings and insights. But even more, he claims that we need to develop and articulate the faith of all of us and our modern perceptions of the world, and so it can't even be a Christian or Muslim or Taoist theology. It must emerge from within a worldwide we, even though we have very different individual and community-based forms of faith. So it's not they or not you, not some, but some of us are Buddhist. Some of us are Muslim. Some of us are Jewish. Some of us are skeptics and humanists and atheists and agnostics. Some of us are confused. But a world theology cannot be less than any of these particular traditions. It has to be recognizable within each of them, not displace them with some kind of universal, transcendent universalism, but it must emerge from genuine dialogue amongst the practitioners and scholars of the various religions, and it can't be created by any one of them outside of that interaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in some Jewish thinkers into our dialogue here tonight and see how they might help us in various ways navigate these very weighty issues. I should say that there is no single authoritative Jewish response to either the legacy of Vatican II or the future of interreligious dialogue. Some of you in the audience might know this joke. You get 2 Jews, you get 5 different opinions, right? So what we have is just a variety of different ways of approaching this subject. Again, none of them authoritative. Jewish religious thinkers like Martin Buber and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel are helpful not only because of their historical location with reference to Vatican II, but because their writings and perspective give us a greater appreciation of how any dialogue contains moments of hope for intersubjective encounter, recognition, and confrontation between the self and other. In his earlier work on the nature of I and thou relationships, Buber reflected on the eros of mutual address involved in reaching out beyond the safe boundaries of the self towards the other. According to Buber, the eros of dialogue helps to shatter the internal monologue resulting from our egotistical desires to retain subject-object distancing and our dominance over otherness. By breaking out from the monologue of egoism, we not only encounter otherness as something that resists being assimilated to our own self-understanding, but we are also given the revelation that this otherness is something for which we are uniquely responsible for, a thou-ness that must be preserved in its otherness. Just as, quote, God needs you in order to be, unquote, so too, according to Buber, each particular I is indispensable for any relationship. We find the affirmation we seek as particular selves through our ability to respect otherness, while also reaching out in the hope for genuine encounter and mutual confirmation. Our sense of encounter and relationship with the other is similar to our revelatory experience of God. Both entail mystery, ineffability, and the shattering of exclusive boundaries. Religious traditions, doctrines, and dogmas, conversely, are merely subjective articulations, according to Buber, of universal human experiences of the eternal thou. But the truth content of revelation is subjectively experienced as a presence of supreme encounter, and therefore the sense of presence and mystery can only be confirmed as truth by each individual. Buber states, every religion has its origin in a revelation. No religion is absolute truth. None is a piece of heaven that has come down to earth. Each religion is a human truth. Religion, Buber warns, can become a form of idolatry and imperialism if it holds onto the fantasy that it solely retains a privileged discourse of correspondence to the truth of revelation. Buber further states, religions must recognize that it is only one of the shapes in which the human elaboration of the divine message is presented, that it has no monopoly on God. Each must renounce being God's house on earth and content itself with being a house of men who are turned towards the same purpose of God, a house with windows. Each must give up its false exclusive attitude. Buber's critique of the exclusive attitude within religion raises a number of interesting questions for the future of interfaith dialogue. If dialogue is a moment in which the boundaries of the self and other are shaken, diminished, perhaps even overcome in that Hegelian sense of sublation, then how much responsibility do we have for maintaining the otherness of the one we are dialoguing with? In other words, if a dialogue is to be genuine, do we have a right to insist that the other person begin from a willingness to be totally transformed by the dialogue? Or can we accept from the outset that the dialogue does not entail a complete transformation of self, but merely a moment of mutual encounter, perhaps a mutual witnessing, as Professor Cornille mentioned, in which we agree to maintain the boundaries of monological dialogue rather than risk what Buber refers to as the eros of genuine confirmation, in which the other becomes a thou. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was actually directly involved in discussions with church leaders during the drafting of Vatican II, follows Buber's ideal of eros by helping to translate the redemptive hope involved in moments of self-other encounters towards the potential healing of Jewish-Christian relations. For Heschel, as a survivor of the Shoah, someone who lost most of his family in Europe, Vatican II represented a great moment of potential historical healing by creating the foundations for future engagement between both Jewish and Catholic faith communities on more equal footing. His now famous essay on interreligious dialogue and healing titled No Religion is an Island, written in 1966, Heschel elaborated on Buber's correlation of idolatry with the exclusive attitude amongst religions by stating that, quote, religion is a means, not the end. It becomes idolatrous when we regard it as an end in itself. He goes on to formulate a progressive position that actually the philosopher David Novak approaches a form of theological relativism. Heschel states that all religions, accordingly, quote, worship one God even without knowing it. Interesting claim. Consequently, we should not confuse the transitory and limited husks of religious doctrines with the sparks of divinity concealed within each tradition and each individual. According to Heschel, quote, the ultimate truth is not capable of being fully and adequately expressed in concepts and words. The ultimate truth is about the situation that pertains between God and man. The Torah speaks in the language of man. Revelation is always an accommodation to the capacity of man. The voice of God reaches the spirit of man in a variety of ways in a multiplicity of languages. One truth comes to expression in many ways of understanding. Echoing the prophet Micah, who proclaimed, quote, let all peoples walk, each one in the name of his God, unquote. For Heschel, the promise of Vatican II and interreligious dialogue is to combine, quote, reverence for different traditions with a commitment to forge common bonds based on shared experiences of radical amazement, fear, awe, and wonder at the mystery of creation. As Heschel states, quote, I suggest that the most significant basis for the meeting of men of different religious traditions is the level of fear and trembling, of humility and contrition, where our individual moments of faith are mere waves in the endless ocean of mankind's reaching out for God, where all formulations and articulations appear as understatements, where our souls are swept away by the awareness of the urgency of answering God's commandment. Thus, the eros of dialogue for Heschel is found in a shared revelatory experience of radical amazement that gives form to the providential desire for multiple ways of understanding and therefore tolerance for our differences, even as we strive to strengthen our spiritual bonds by overcoming sectarian boundaries. By affirming that, quote, religious pluralism is the will of God, and through the power of love, according to Heschel, we can all mutually prepare for redemption. In conclusion, Heschel thus encourages us to both recognize the great milestone that Vatican II historically represented, but also strive after Buber's model of eros through dialogue and the overcoming of boundaries as we seek to actualize greater love and mutual reverence for both others, for our otherness and our commonality. From Heschel's perspective, the importance is not agreeing on the content of discourses that speak to the inner depths of the soul, but whether or not we act with reverence for the sparks of the divine within each of us. Because as he states, quote, holiness is not the monopoly of any particular religion or tradition. The world is too small for anything but mutual care and deep respect. The world is too great for anything but responsibility for one another. Nevertheless, nearly 50 years after Vatican II, the challenge continues in Heschel's terms of, quote, how to combine loyalty to one's tradition with reverence for different traditions. Although Heschel was critical of secular attempts at banishing all religious sensibilities from the public arena, he also affirmed the importance of distinguishing the public civic realm from the private. Herein may in fact be our most promising solution. As long as we mutually agree to uphold liberal democratic principles of equal rights and protections in our private lives, we also have a right to cling to comprehensive doctrines that allow us to feel uniquely chosen or deserving of salvation. Thankfully, in the 21st century, in a liberal democratic society, the choice is up to us. We can choose to confront the awe, mystery, anxieties, and mystery of existence from the islands of self and community, or we can seek to build greater cosmopolitan bridges to other individuals and communities. Both choices, however, involve degrees of fear and trembling. How we face these challenges will most likely depend on how much eros we want versus our needs for boundaries. But the important thing following Heschel is that we keep on dialoguing by starting with openness, mutual reverence, and radical amazement at the mystery of creation. All the rest is commentary. Thank you.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. I begin with the name of God, the most merciful, the compassionate. Peace be upon you, my dear brothers and sisters, friends, my teacher, Professor Crowley, and to whom I'm very thankful for inviting me, and Professor Cornille. I'm sorry I was late. I got stuck in 880. There was a huge traffic. And I'm an IT engineer. I depend too much on smartphones. I should have gotten my map and bring the map. I got lost. Anyway, but I was happy to hear some of these comments by Professor Cornille. I come from, of course, Islamic background, but we are Sufis. We are much more mystical, much more forgiving, much more unitive, meditative traditions. I had the chance of reading the Nostra Aetate given in the class of Professor Crowley, and I think it is a watershed document for relationship between the Catholicism and the rest of the other religious traditions. And I believe that what the Catholic Church has stated in the document, and I would like to read it to you, and I love that. The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and life, those precepts and teachings which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of the truth which enlightens all men. I think this is a wonderful achievement, given the previous conflicts between religions, particularly between Christianity and other religions, and also in between Christianity, whether it's Catholicism, Protestant. I thought that was wonderful. From an Islamic point of view, after that Vatican II, there are a lot of delegations from the Islamic world went to the Vatican and vice versa. And there was much better interreligious dialogues took place. And the latest one being there is a called Common Word Project, which is started by a group of Islamic leaders and scholars, wrote a letter saying what we have common, let's do some work together. And it wrote to Pope, at that time, Pope Benedict, and the other Christian leaders, based on some mutual understanding. And that common word has become somewhat like almost like a Catholic Church for the Islamic world, because Islamic world, unlike our Catholic friends, who has a very central authority, we don't have. And that also creates lots of chaos, confusions, violence, terrorism, because there is no central authority. Everybody is taking a free interpretation of the religion. So that common word came out of that, and there was a delegation in 2008. The Islamic delegation went to the Catholic Church and had delegations. They started talking. I just want to say that, in spite of the fact what Professor Cornille said, that the document does not affirm the salvific truth in all the other religions. It is true that every religion says the salvation should come from us, but it does open the road, open the gate for other religions to talk. And I quote Hans Kung, he said that there will be never peace on earth without peace among the religions, and I believe in it. There won't be any peace. So at least we can have peaceful dialogues with the different religious groups. From an Islamic point of view, I would like to say that according to Islam, there is no exclusive right of salvation. And I would like to, if I may, I would like to quote from Quran. And first I would like to tell you what the Quran says and how to make dialogues with people. Say, O people of the scripture, come to a common word between us and you, that we shall worship none but God, and that we shall ascribe no partner unto him, and none of us shall take others for lords beside God. And if they turn away, then say, bear witness that we are they who have surrendered unto him. So from that common word that I just mentioned to you, an initiative has been done to the Christians and Muslim dialogue. Here, people of the scriptures are the Christians and Jews, the people who got the revelations before Islam. And I'd like to quote another, which is my favorite, in Quran, Surah 2, verse 62. Those who believe in the Quran, comma, and those who follow the Jewish scriptures, comma, and the Christians and the Sabians, there was another religious monotheistic group in Arabia, comma, not only that, any who believe in Allah and the last day and work righteousness shall have their reward with the Lord. On them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve. And another saying, we believe in God and in what was sent down to us, and in what was sent down to Abraham, Ismail, Isaac, Jacob, and the patriarchs, and what was given to Moses and Jesus, and all the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction among any of them. To him alone we are submitters. It is very clear from these verses that the Quran does not require an exclusive salvific value only to itself. Another verse two of them I'd like to quote. To every people was sent an apostle. When their apostle comes before them, the matter will be judged between them with justice, and they'll not be wrong. If it had been thy Lord's will, they would all have been believed, all who are on earth. Will thou then compel mankind against their will to believe? No soul can believe except by the will of Allah, and He will place doubt or obscurity of those who will not understand. We sent not a messenger except to teach in a language of His own people, in order to make things clear to them. Now Allah leaves astray those whom He pleases, and guides whom He pleases, for He is exalted in power, full of wisdom. So, according to Islamic viewpoint, the salvation is not exclusive to Islam. However, it has to be said, Islam claims that it is the final revelation. There will be no more prophet or revelation after Islam. And Jesus, according to interpretation, that he did predict a prophet coming after him. There are also, in Old Testaments, there is some mentions of a prophet coming out of Arabia. But I come from a Sufi background, so I would like to quote the Sufi. There was a very famous Sufi, Theosophist, his name is Ibn Arabi, about 11th to 12th century Spain. And he said that Islam, it recognizes to be the final edition of all the monotheistic tradition from Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus. And the position of Islam vis-a-vis the other faith is this, that it's like as if the sun has risen. So the Islam is the final religion, sun. But that doesn't necessarily mean at night there are stars which guide people. So the position of Islam is this, the final revelation. It when the day comes, it just overshadow every other stars. But at night, the stars are still guides. And regarding the dialogue that has been, that I think is very important, is because that way, one thing, we understand each other. The sort of conflict go away, animosity go away. When you sit down in a room, talk about God, it strengthens our faith. And I would quote another Sufi poet, who was Rumi. When he died, his burial, his coffin was carried by a Muslim, Christian, Jew, and a Zoroastrian on the four sides. So many people ask, you are a Christian and Jew, why you are crying and caring for him? He said that Rumi has deepened my faith, our faiths, whether it is Judaism or Christianity. Instead of trying to proselytize and try to say, give up your faith and embrace it, he strengthened, and we became much more better Christian or better Jews. So, in other words, the other religions could provide as a mirror, as Christianity does to us as Muslims and the Jews, I think. And because every human being is a mirror to each other, similarly, every religion is a mirror to each other. And sometimes there is a degradation in particular religious society, and another religion perhaps work as a sort of uplifting. And that's why I believe that we should come together and have dialogue, but I do not believe that there should be only one religion, a sort of one effort to come together to bring up in one religion, one revelatory experience, etc. Because it's not possible. It's like you have a medicine box. Each medicine is beautiful. Each medicine has certain effect. You cannot take all the medicine together and make one medicine. So I believe that all religions should maintain their identity, but we should have dialogues. We should have, in a global village, we should work together, and we can have lot of efforts like ending poverty, ending violence to women, ending discrimination, ending bigotry. We can work together to do that. So I think there are a lot of joint efforts that can be accomplished without even trying to convert others or to make it one religion. Thank you very much.
I really like the idea of the worldwide we and the idea of balancing a devotion to our religion with a respect for otherness. But so when I think about that, I wonder, like, how do we avoid just making a different group the other? How do we avoid, instead of being Christians who see other religions as the other, how do we avoid that going from we are the religious against atheists? Or do you know what I'm saying? How do we just keep, I don't know, how do we avoid doing that, I guess is what I'm saying. So do you have any ideas about that?
May I? Please, Professor
Please,
Cornille.
no, go ahead.
Before being anything,
Please speak up.
oh, sorry. Before being anything, we are human beings first. You are, I do not know what is your religion, but when I look at you as a human being, a lady. So the most common thing among all religions that we are humanist first and foremost. Whether that person is believing or not, or a religious person, he's a human being. And I think this is the most important. Secondly is that I'm an engineer, but I'm also wearing this religious garb. So if there is somebody is an engineer and there's a doctor, is this like a two tribes? No. There will be differences, like there are differences in, and it is a divine mercy to have one of the verses in Quran that one of the mercies of God is that He gave different tongues and different color of the skin and races. So I think diversity is good, unity in diversity, like different flowers in a garden. But I don't think it is a problem, certainly not in America, of different religious groups living together and sharing.
May I just pick up on the last part, not in America. Luckily, we have a liberal democratic state that protects the imperialist content within a lot of religious traditions.
You need to speak up.
Sorry. So that's a very important safeguard. and it changes the dynamic of the conversation. Where we're having this conversation matters, right? Having this in Stanford, California matters. If we're having this in other parts of the world, it would change the nature of the conversation. So to some extent, in terms of your own kind of figuring out that, that's just something people within the conversation have to kind of figure out where you want to take from atheists, what part you want to say, wait a minute, that's too different, right? But we need to have these protections so that the imperialist part of us that might want to say, I may see your otherness as a threat, is limited. And that I think is an essential component of what allows us to actually engage in this dialogue.
I just want to say something maybe about the world theology, because you also referred to it, which is very appealing in one way. But I think we have to also be wary of the imperialistic aspects or dangers that are also present in the idea of a world theology. Who is going to decide what the common elements are and how religions come together? So I think it sounds very positive and very pluralistic and integrative, but there's always sort of the question of what criteria are going to be used to decide what is true and valuable. And those criteria will always have to come from within a particular religious tradition. And I think in many ways it's more honest to admit that, to say, well, I like this and that, and I will see if I can learn from that and enrich my own tradition. And hopefully, as different religions enrich themselves through dialogue, they will grow closer and closer. So I think that might be a more realistic idea of a world theology, where as each religion learns from the other on the basis of its own criteria, religions come closer together, rather than the kind of abstract idea of a world theology that holds the danger of one or the other religion imposing its own view of the truth on other religions.
Could you offer an example of an element from Hinduism or Buddhism that has helped deepen, your Christian faith, for example?
Oh, I could offer so many, but I'll just give you one. So an important idea in Christianity is, of course, love of God, right? It's quite central to our faith. But I have never learned what it meant as much as when I have read Hindu texts dealing with love of God. I've discovered a new intensity of love of God in reading Hindu texts that just completely blew me away and brought me back to my own tradition and the texts that are part of my own tradition and that were just sort of covered by sort of the accumulation of history, sort of weighted down. And then you discover sort of what's in your own tradition and what you've neglected or ignored or has sort of been marginalized in your own tradition. So to me, reading Hindu texts and feeling the kind of intensity of love of God that's there, just completely imagine what it can mean for me, also within the Christian tradition. More common learning from Hinduism. So many Christians practice yoga, of course. So these are kind of common practices that are part of that have now sort of become part of Christian self-understanding almost, and have almost naturally become integrated in the tradition. So it's one of the things that I'm thinking about now in terms of interreligious learning. Can we really learn something genuinely new or different from another religious tradition, and to which extent can we really learn something different? What happens usually in learning is, as I say, sort of the other religion becoming the catalyst for me to rediscover something in my own tradition that was forgotten or neglected or marginalized, or sometimes even declared heresy in the course of history. And suddenly, people like Marguerite Porete is now again the hero in Christianity. Well, she was burned at the stake, but people, read her texts again and discover sort of similarities between her readings and Buddhist readings and, sort of apophatic mystical tradition. So that's what usually happens in dialogue, is the other tradition being a catalyst, as you were also saying, a mirror or a catalyst to sort of reawaken aspects of your own tradition that have become forgotten. But a more interesting question is sort of the newness of the other tradition. Do we just rediscover what we already knew? Or do we actually reinterpret what we already knew through the lens of the other? You see, so I don't think I don't think my understanding of love of God is just what it always was. I think it's changed through the catalyst that Hinduism was for me. I think I sort of have a different taste because I've gone through Hinduism and come back. I think there's sort of something slightly different or new. And then sort of genuinely new teachings, I think there's a whole lot we can learn from each other, but I don't think we can learn anything from each other. I think there are limits to mutual learning, and those are determined by our own self-understanding and the limits of orthodoxy. And I don't think we can learn something that would be in contradiction to Jesus' teaching. And of course, it's not true that other religions don't teach things that are in contradiction to Jesus' teachings. They do, And I think we have to be honest about that in dialogue also, that there are limits to what we can learn from each other. But, given those limits, there's still a whole lot of room for learning, I think.
I've got a question, just a follow-up to that. I'm sorry to ask the question, but I've got to ask it because it has to do with the nature of dialogue itself, because it strikes me, and it's kind of picking up a note from Akiba, and then I think you also developed it some in your talk, Catherine, but that the nature of dialogue involves opening ourselves to the other in such a way that to some degree we put ourselves at risk in allowing the other's witness to enter into our own world, Mm-hmm. And you're certainly suggesting that has happened to you in the reading of Hindu texts and so forth. I'm wondering, though, where one draws the line that you're suggesting that we need to draw, I think, in saying that, there may be some teachings, for example, that could contradict, let us say, some of the teachings of Jesus, and those we cannot receive, we can only know. How does, in the actual practice of dialogue and of opening oneself in reverence and awe, as Akiba put it, and openness to the other, how do we know when should we put on the brakes, or how do we know when to put on the brakes, so to speak, as you seem to be suggesting?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I've pondered a lot. A number of people involved in dialogue would argue that you can only have a real dialogue if you are willing to convert to the position of the other, if that presents itself as a necessity or a possibility. And that sounds good to me. That sounds good as an idea for dialogue. I just don't see it as a very realistic position from a realistic requirement first for dialogue. If we require this, I don't think very many people would enter into dialogue. I also don't think it's absolutely necessary. I mean, certain types of dialogue may be, if it can go that far, then that's fine. But I don't think it necessarily has to go that far for a dialogue to be authentic and genuine, and for religions to learn from one another. So I think dialogue between religions, and that's what distinguishes interreligious dialogue from kind of New Age shopping, is that you are grounded in a particular religion and engage the other tradition from a particular normative standpoint. And that normativity isn't always right up front, but implicit. You have a worldview and a commitment that shapes what you appreciate and what you don't appreciate in the other, and that forms the basis for integrating what you learn from the other. So I don't think it's necessary for genuine learning from the other that you open yourself completely to the possibility of conversion to the other.
Right. There are certain levels of conversion, though, of course. There's intellectual, moral, and then religious, and so forth. I suppose it could become, there could be layers or levels of openness to the other that could result maybe in some change of mind, let's say in the realm of ethics or something like that.
Right, yeah. I mean, I think in small ways. Then the question is, at what point in your conversion are you actually, do you really belong to the other religion and rather than your own? So I see many people actually involved in interreligious dialogue are involved in dialogue because they love the other tradition. They're really interested in the other tradition. And I think for some, the other tradition implicitly or explicitly becomes actually normative to interpret their own tradition. So that's to me an interesting phenomenon also. People involved in dialogue, in some cases I think have implicitly already converted to the other, but maintain a kind of nostalgic attachment to their original tradition. So it's a complicated thing, So they try to remain rooted in their own tradition and integrate elements from the other. So.
Beth Ann? No.
Annabeth.
Annabeth.
So my question is kind of a two-part question, and because like Professor Cornille started off saying you were interested in inculturation, and so the first half of the question is, to what extent are the products of inculturation cultural, and to what extent they are theological? And then following on from there, what I'd also like to ask is, because you were mentioning how Nostra Aetate moves away from like supersessionist approaches to Judaism, but in interreligious dialogue you mentioned borrowing so much from other traditions. What is the risk that supersessionism shows up or surfaces again, but more in the form of appropriation?
Good questions, big ones also. So first about inculturation and interreligious dialogue. I think the church or official magisterial documents always try to distinguish the two, inculturation and interreligious dialogue. But of course, inculturation involves using the spiritual resources of a particular culture to re-express the Christian faith in a non-Western context. And what will those spiritual resources of the culture be? They are the religious resources. So, of course, there are certain cultural elements that are non-religious that could be used, in the process of inculturation. But most of the time, those resources are spiritual or religious resources that have shaped that culture in its history and that are then engaged in the process of inculturation. So my early work was on the inculturation of Christianity in India and the use of categories like guru, ashram, and so forth, and new interpretations of the uniqueness of Jesus and so on in the Hindu or in an Indian context. Well, of course, all of these things come from Hinduism. So I don't think that there's, you can make that sharp distinction between inculturation and interreligious dialogue. Inculturation, if inculturation is about using the cultural elements in order to reinterpret Christian faith for a particular culture, or it can be applied to any faith, it's a matter of interreligious dialogue, integrating elements from another religion in expressing Christian faith. And that's what, people like Bede Griffiths and Abhishektananda and Panikar and all these people have done with India. Then the idea of supersessionism, that's a really interesting one, because indeed what you do in interreligious dialogue is often, so there are limits to the possibility of appropriating the other tradition in its own terms, right? So religions are, and I'm, post-liberal enough in that sense, there are certain irreconcilable differences between religions. So when one religion appropriates elements from another religion, there is always a degree of domestication, is a term that's usually used. Domestication or reinterpretation of another religion in one's own religious categories. And that's, I suppose, you can call it a form of supersessionism, but it can be done, I think, with an attitude of humility instead of arrogance. It can be done with an attitude that this is all I can do from within my own religious and cultural framework. I cannot accept the other completely in the self-understanding of the other. I know that the other self-understanding is different from mine, and that it has its own value and authenticity and integrity. But from my perspective, if I'm going to integrate something from the other tradition, I will reinterpret it in some ways so that it fits within my framework. So you can do that with an attitude of humility, or this is all I can do, knowing that the other does it, of course, with your religion too. You know, when Hindus in the 19th century became fascinated with the figure of Jesus, they didn't see him as the only Son of God. You know, they saw him as the greatest, you know, moral figure in maybe the history of humanity, but not as the unique Son of God, you know, only begotten and so forth. They interpreted Jesus in their own terms and adapted Jesus to their own context. And if we know that we're all doing that, you know, then there's something a little bit less guilty, you know, I suppose, about it. You know, it's a kind of hermeneutic necessity, I think, that leads all religions to do that.
We have time for one more question.
Catherine, my question is prompted by a text in Depuis. It's from Paul VI, from Evangelii Nuntiandi 75. And Paul VI says that the church has the function of proclaiming the religion of Jesus. And that phrase jumped out at me because in biblical scholarship, that's a term of art for the religion that Jesus himself embraced. Non-incarnational, non-Christological, as contrasted with the religion about Jesus that evolves later. Now, since historical science now allows us to make that distinction, whether we're believers or not believers, I would argue that Nostra Aetate and all of Vatican II is ignorant of that. It just does not take that on board, and rather has a kind of a one-way street view of history where the later period trumps the earlier. So Johannine Christology trumps Synoptic Christology, which trumps Jesus' Christology. Can you imagine that the magisterium would ever take on board such a historical consciousness that would make that kind of a distinction when it's trying to define what it is that it's actually preaching? Because if it actually did, then most of the problems of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism would just disappear. I raise this because your interests are in methodology, and this question goes to the issue of historical methodology and its impact on the magisterium when we enter a dialogue.
Yeah. Can I imagine that the magisterium would ever go there? Not right now, no, but, you know, who knows? I mean, that would, of course, undo, you know, the whole history of the councils also. I mean, the whole history of the church with all of its doctrinal developments and so on. So, you know, we would go pre-Nicaea. You know, that's sort of where we would end up, which, you know, is very attractive to many indeed. But it's sort of, I think it would be, I mean, I cannot imagine it, you know, in my lifetime. Who knows how things would develop, but it would undo the whole history of Christianity, which is of course also part of the tradition, right? Tradition is also part of revelation from a Catholic point of view. So maybe that's more thinkable, you know, in other Christian denominations than in the Catholic Church.
Thank you very much.